Let me now formally welcome His Royal Highness, the Prince of Asturias, who has been so kind to join us today. Muchas gracias, señor. Bienvenido de nuevo, cuarta vez en la universidad. Muchas gracias. And now we would like to hear from the moderators of our three panels, who will give us their summaries of today's discussion and presentation. Can I ask Jonas Pricing, Agatha Benito, and Rifat Sarichaulu to join me here on the stage, please?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm honored and privileged to be here to summarize the debate that we have at the employer panel and describe our perspective on youth unemployment. So first of all, unemployment by any name is very difficult for society and any individual that is affected by it. Youth unemployment, however, which is at twice the rate of the average unemployment rate, is extremely difficult, certainly for the individuals, but also very much so for society. Why? It is a generation of future workforce that gets affected, and it's a scourge for the countries in that their ability to grow is going to be dependent on access to talent and a skilled workforce. So in our panel discussion, as you recall, we discussed the paradox between high levels of unemployment, in particular for youth, and yet organizations and employers saying that they have difficult finding the right people to fill jobs today here in Europe. So 2 million jobs have gone unfilled across Europe. Minister von der Leyen before talked about 1 million vocational jobs being unfilled in Germany. This is certainly true in other countries as well as for organizations all across Europe. And frankly, as you think about this and as you listen and read publications, you will notice this is a phenomenon that's not only European in nature, it's actually global in nature, which goes back to this notion that we are faced with certainly cyclical challenges, but also structural challenges. We are living in a changing world of work that is requiring a different level of skill and is requiring everyone to finish school, but certainly then also go on and gather further education and specific training to the openings and the job opportunities that exist. So in our employer panel, we talked about three ideas on how this can be solved. The first one would be a much closer collaboration between government institutions, educational institutions, and employers. If we believe that this is a paradigm shift, it is clear that we need to approach this issue in non-traditional ways. The challenge here is also that this is evolving very rapidly. So we don't have much time to address this, because once the cycle turns back, we will have a bigger structural problem in the future, not a smaller one. So this almost tripartite collaboration is going to be crucial. On a more specific level, when you look at countries or organizations, countries in particular, all over the world, and certainly here in Europe, that have managed to bring down youth unemployment to a more manageable level, you find a common denominator. And that common denominator is the much closer proximity between business and education. So the ability to understand what is needed on a just-in-time basis, that collaboration in the countries that have low youth unemployment works the best and has institutionalized mechanisms to make that happen. And that, we believe, is a further area that we need to place a great deal of emphasis on. And then last but not least, if we are living in a world, as we have many times in our past, experiencing creative destruction that destroys jobs because of changes in technology. If you think back, this is something that we've lived through all through our history. Jobs are destroyed, but then in the end, more jobs are created because of opportunities arise. We believe the creation of those jobs are going to a large degree, come from entrepreneurial activities, self-employed activities, smaller companies that can generate growth within themselves. And of course, that means that from a legislative perspective, anything that we can do to facilitate small and medium-sized enterprises to grow as well as be created is going to be extremely helpful to create job creations that will be a great font of opportunity for our youth. So with that, I now hand it over to my colleague on education.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. His Royal Highness, thank you very much for being here today. You're more than welcome to Universidad Europea. It's a great pleasure to have you participating in the Laureate Summit on Youth and Jobs. I was lucky enough as to moderate the panel on the perspective of the educators, and I hope the panelists and the public enjoyed as much as I did. The experts that led the discussion were all committed to create a better future. They posed insightful ideas and made very interesting proposals to hopefully be considered by all stakeholders. We had Svava Bjarnason, Principal Education Specialist at the International Finance Corporation within the World Bank Group. We also had Enrique Iglesias, who, as you know, has served as the first Ibero-American General Secretary for the last 8 years. Joaquín Moya, the Chairman of the Association of the Spanish Universities Governing Bodies. Rafael Otero, the President of our Student Council at Universidad Europea. And John de Zulueta, the President of our Advisory Board. We discussed the importance of reducing the gap between education and labor needs. We also talked about competency development of our students. It was interesting to hear about mobility and the globalized workforce and the role of technology creating a much wider access for students all over the world, not only to education, but also to communication and interaction. Some of the participants pointed out the need for information and advice that will allow students to make the right choices concerning their education and future. Similarities and differences between Europe, the Arab world, and Latin America were discussed, but many of the proposals could be applied anywhere in the world. A fundamental conclusion was that greater connection between educators and employers is required. According to our experts, to close the gap between the labor needs and the available talent, we need to do that. It was suggested that internships should be a fundamental part of curricula, and advisory and governing boards should also have a more active role than they have today. We spoke about the importance of soft skills, some of them being mentioned in recent reports like interpersonal skills, teamwork, adaptation, and a group of transferable skills that will help graduates succeed in the labor market. Some educational best practices were mentioned in Finland, in the United States, particularly interesting and necessary, those trying to promote entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial spirits. The importance of primary and secondary education was agreed to, both in the sense of students' preparation when they go to the university, but also in relation with the direct youth employment in the less developed countries. We didn't have enough time to deeply discuss the educational model of business schools, but the need to revise such models after the learnings of such a profound global crisis was strongly suggested. It seems that the Bologna process brings excellent ideas along, but we didn't think many universities, at least in Spain, had implemented its principles in an efficient manner. I wish we had had time to speak about teachers and values and investments, but time flies. So what we now are looking for is to all those comments and inspired reflections from the Prince and from President Clinton. We are lucky to have so widely recognized world leaders in our summit, so thank you, Bill Clinton, and of course, thank you, Prince Felipe, for your insights and proposals.
Your Royal Highness, ladies and gentlemen, I had the pleasure of moderating the government panel. I would like to again recognize them. From Cyprus, Kyriakos Knirizos. From Italy, Joanna Melandri. From Ireland, Rory Quinn. From Spain, Montserrat Comandio. And from Germany, Ursula von der Leyen. The things that we covered is actually what I think individually, each day by day, they live through these difficult times, trying to find solutions for the youth, trying to find the right educational reforms, and then trying to get these policies passed through their Congresses and Senates. The things that we noted the most has been the vocational success of the German system, whereby the main aspect there was the certification, and the recognition is an essential part to the system, and what the minister called is the modern vocational model. And Spain is doing this education reform as one of its most relevant changes. In terms of social responsibility, we covered the social responsibility being part of the change, and that it creates immediate job opportunities for the youth. Many of the youth are not waiting for long-term solutions, and many of the youth are waiting for immediate solutions. This was one of the outcomes that we thought could be useful. The think, feel, act approach, we said, should be enforced in schools rather than memorizing and not thinking. So the think, feel, act was one of the main mottos we had. Another one was training the teachers, because there's so much change going on, and we need to change the system by changing the teaching methodologies and training the teachers. Another important aspect we covered was the mobility among youth in Europe. Actually, there was a fruitful discussion where I think the outcome was that we need to think as Europeans in one Europe, not as individual countries. There was a comment in terms of capital and support for small industries to incorporate the development of the talent and the youth. So the policies that need to be in place. Another policy that we talked about was the tax policies on work should be more homogeneous. There are so many uncertainties, actually, when we discussed for the future, educating for the future. We agree that there are so many uncertainties, and we know that we are educating for the uncertainty and for the future. So different models need to be developed. We also talked about the mismatch of talent for certain fields. It was a key problem. And lastly, but importantly, that we need integration amongst education and employment policies. Thank you again.
I ask them to just wait 1 second, just because I would like to say thank you to them on behalf of Laureate, on behalf of the Universidad Europea, and also on behalf of the audience today. You have done very, very great job. Thank you. Thank you very much. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Doug Becker, founder, chairman, and CEO of Laureate Universities, who will be joined by the 42nd President of the United States, Bill Clinton. Please join me in giving them a warm welcome.
Thank you so much, President Clinton, because for just a second, I thought they were clapping for me. No, we're so excited to have you here. We've had a fantastic day. I remember speaking months and months ago with you about this idea, and you were so encouraging that we should proceed with this event and that we should really tackle this very difficult topic, even if easy answers aren't at hand. And with your support and sponsorship, and we're so grateful to have the Prince's sponsorship and authority of this event, we were able to bring together an incredible mix of leaders from government, from business, from the education sector, and we also have many of our own students in the audience supporting the event, and from our other universities in Europe who are watching us as a live event. So it has been just a fantastic day. I think the discussions have been very, very fertile and frank and open, And there are some concrete ideas that I think we can all work on as we proceed forward. But for all of us, and certainly for me, the high point is now, the chance for you to hear a little bit about some of the solutions and ideas that were discussed, and also for us to be able to ask you some of your reactions to what you might hear and what you might think about tackling this crisis, and not just in the abstract, but to tackle it here in Spain, where we know that more than 50% of youth are unemployed. Now, we did have a presentation early this morning around the importance of education, and some statistics were unveiled by the market research firm Millward Brown Optimer, in which they described that, in general, university students have about a 70% employment rate compared to the more than 50% unemployment for the general youth population. But the students who go to private universities actually have about an 80% employment rate. And I think that can be explained by a number of factors, including self-selection. But we were extremely proud to be able to announce that the Universidad Europea here has a 90% employment rate, which in this environment we think is an accomplishment. In normal times, one of our speakers commented that you would hope that even more than 90% would be employed a year after they were graduated. But in this case, we realized these are not normal times. So that's the backdrop of what we've spent our day doing. And I thought you might have a few comments or remarks you might like to make, and then I have some questions, and then more importantly, our students have some questions for you.
Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you for bringing me back to this university. Miguel, thank you for welcoming me again. This is my second trip here, and every time I come, I have to work, so I don't get to see as much as I'd like to. But it's a really beautiful place. I'd like to thank the ministers with whom I just met and the other distinguished people who have participated. And I was backstage. We were backstage watching all the reports that you just gave on the monitor, which is why we were a little bit late making our entrance. And we were talking about what they mean. The only thing I would like to say by way of introduction is that this topic has obsessed me, the question of youth employment, how to prepare young people for the workplace, where to find the jobs, for more than 30 years now. I grew up in a state which, in the year I was born, had an income, per capita income, that was just barely more than 50% of the American average. When I became the governor of my state, we had a horrible collapse of the economy in America in the middle of the country in the 1980s. And our unemployment rate was above America's average for the first 9 years I served. And we worked for 9 years to restructure the economy and to restructure the education system. But in the 10th year, we led the country in job growth. So I would say, I understand there are no magic bullets here. And the only thing I would like to say, in echoing what Doug said, is that if you change the education mix of a country and the training mix, you also change the economic mix, and vice versa. So it still matters. We had a big article in the New York Times on Sunday when Hillary and I were home talking about this that said, as difficult as things are for young people, and as difficult as things are for university graduates, even in the US, where the unemployment rate is considerably lower than Spain, it's still better to have this education and training than not. And I think that's something that every student, not only here, but throughout Spain and throughout Europe, should keep in mind. So let's talk about more. The final thing I want to say is I congratulate you on having the courage to have this, because people are so full of frustration, so full of fear, often full of anger, that a lot of people say, well, I can't figure out what to do about this in a way that will make the problem go away, so I'll talk about something else. I think it's a great mistake. So to the employers, the people involved in job training, people from government here, I think you did the right thing. This is not an easy issue. It will not be resolved instantaneously. There are some macroeconomic changes that I believe are absolutely essential for you to have a full recovery. And I'll just put that on the table. We won't have to talk about that, but I think you can educate and train and do all these things we want to talk about. But I do not believe that Spain or Greece or Italy or the rest of Europe, now it's even affecting Germany and France, I do not believe that you can have full recovery if you maintain constant austerity at a time when there is no growth and interest rates are low inflation. So I think the Eurozone is going to have some help from the central bank and is going to have to basically move the economy along before this problem can be completely solved. But there are some things that can be done in every country that will make a difference, speed the recovery, and when it comes, create more jobs. And I hope we can focus on that today.
Well, that was a great lead-in to my very first question for you, in which we were going to ask about the global recession. There's no doubt that, as you say, this issue is directly related to economic conditions. And if economic conditions were better, the problem would be less bad, although it wouldn't be absent. We know that even during Spain's very strong years, that youth unemployment in Spain was higher than in some other countries. And we had a chance to discuss earlier why that might be and what could be done about it. But I'm curious, we do see some economists who begin to see the beginning of an improvement starting in the United States. Do you have any sense of how long you think it might take before young people start to see the results of a renewed investment in hiring?
I think it will be different in different places, but I think in the Eurozone at large, there's a reason that you're stuck at a lower growth rate than you see Asia beginning to creep up, the U.S. is beginning to creep up. I just think at a time when demand is weak and private investment is weak and unemployment is high, if you have a studied policy of years of austerity without anything to boost the economy, you're going to have trouble. Now, it's interesting, if you look at an analogy to America, our individual states all had to practice austerity when the collapse came because they couldn't print money. It was illegal for them to run deficits. Some get around it, but by and large, it's illegal to run deficits. But their economies were kept afloat in part because of transfers from the national government, money to help pay for unemployment, for food, for other basic conditions of life, and they were helped by the policies of the Federal Reserve, our equivalent of your central bank. So my observation is it still matters. And let me say, I think a lot of the things that you've had to do are going to help you a lot in the long run. If you look at Spain, I think adding some flexibility to your labor market will be good. I frankly think that having open immigration policies among all members of the Eurozone is a good thing because for years when Spain was growing like crazy, people came here. And now if your young people want, they can train and go someplace where unemployment is lower and then come home when it gets better. I think on balance, that's a good thing. But you have to feel optimistic in the long run if you have good policies because there's probably no place on earth where there are this many people that already have this much education. The human capital of Europe is staggering. The economic potential is staggering. If you didn't have such low growth rate now, I would be here asking you to examine the countries, the different policies of various countries based on what their median age is and what their annual birth rate is. Because demographics determine the destiny of a country and a continent to some extent. I can tell you all this, having lost it, youth matters. For all the problems young people have today, the young people of Spain are your future. And one of the reasons I'm optimistic about America is that we're younger than Europe. We're younger than every country in Europe except Ireland. And we're about to be younger than China if they stay with the one China policy and the immigration policy they have. So that's what I have to say. I think, let's talk about the specifics. But in general, you have too much human capital, too much embedded infrastructure, too much productive capacity. I think at some point you will burst out of this and do great. But I think it is very difficult if there's no countervailing investment to the austerity of the budget policies.
Mr. President, I thought I'd take the opportunity to ask the Minister of Labor from Germany, Minister von der Leyen, if you would just comment on that same topic. Really, how do you see the lag of effect between economic improvement and when youth may start to benefit from it? You can take this one.
It won't work.
Well, we have a parallel process. Mr. President, you know that we had the problem of a high sovereign debt level in different countries. And of course, the Eurozone, the single money, the single currency we had, was at the beginning very cheap money. So you had the temptation not to invest in competitivity anymore because the money you could get was so cheap. And that led, of course, to this vicious cycle of rising sovereign debts. And we reached the point in Europe where we had no confidence anymore what foreign investors were concerned. That was our problem. It was not voluntarily that we started to get our budget fixed, but it was because the foreign investors did not want to invest in Europe anymore because they had no confidence to get their money back. A very simple story. And therefore, this process of realizing you can only spend what you basically produce in values was one step in Europe. So the end of the story was that we moved forward to what we call the fiscal union, which is your advantage having the United States of America. You have a government that is basically a fiscal union for your 50 states. That is one point. I'm with you with a second point, that having said that it was necessary to reform, and to reform the labor markets too. Of course, we are at a moment now where we have to take capital to invest in healthy structures. We were talking about that before, like, for example, offering loans with moderate interest rates for small and medium enterprises that are basically healthy, but who at the moment do not get any capital because the national banks have a problem. So that these healthy small and medium enterprises are able to take offers from abroad and to provide jobs. The second part is in the medium term that we were thinking about or talking about establishing better structures of vocational training so that the young generation gets a hands-on, enterprise-based education, the skills that are needed in the future. So the European process we are in at the moment, being, to make a long story short, is on one hand reform, you buy time, and on the other hand, of course, invest at the right moment, at the right speed to have growth again. That's the tricky situation we're in right now. I think we are at a point where in Europe we need kind of a new deal to invest in sustainable jobs, not forgetting that we need to reform our countries because it's the global market we are competing with as Europeans.
First of all, I don't have any problem with that, and I'm very sympathetic. I'm more sympathetic with the dilemma that Germany has faced than a lot of people are. I mean, the Germans have put a lot of money into this whole enterprise since the economy went down, and I think the rest of Europe sometimes tends to underestimate it. But one thing that's happened is that creditors can be unlimited in being ravenous to be repaid. And if all the money is put in right before the creditor bell rings, then all the money goes to the creditors and none of the money goes to invest in new businesses and new jobs and new training and all that. It's a terrible tightrope they've had to walk. And the low interest rates, which you quite properly pointed out, essentially for years, the rest of Europe got to borrow at German interest rates because of the existence of the euro. Let me take you back a little in history here. When I was president, and Chancellor Kohl and President Chirac of France told me they wanted to do a financial union before there was a fiscal or a political union, I said, if that's what you want, I'll support it. I believe in the European enterprise. I believe in the European Union. But you need to think about now what you can't imagine, which is what are you going to do when this thing goes south? Or what will you do when one or two countries get in trouble? Because if you wait till then it will be looked at as a calamity for the whole thing if new rules have to be carved out or something has to happen. So we are where we are. I think you've made the best of it. Let me say to you, I hate all this debt. I paid down hundreds of billions of dollars of America's national debt. I actually reduced it in absolute terms. I don't like it. But there is a limit to how much any fiscal policy will work if government austerity does not lower interest rates. If government austerity lowers interest rates, then what happens is there's more private activity, businesses get started, and private growth swamps public contraction. That's what happened when I was in office. It was easy for me compared to the dilemma you have now. And so I agree with that. But let's talk a little about what we came here to talk about. It seems to me, you mentioned Germany and small and medium-sized firms. If I were running, or if I were the leader of any European country now, and I were worried about youth unemployment, I would say, first of all, who's doing better than we're doing? In Europe or in anything that looks like a comparable economic situation. And secondly, what are they doing that we're not doing? And in addition to the financial situation, Germany deserves a lot of credit for having an extraordinarily good worker training system, one that is flexible and is constantly changing as the markets change. And secondly, having the remarkable ability to get small and medium-sized firms into exporting. Spain just ran its first trade surplus for however many years, I don't know, a long time. I would be worried, I would be thinking about how can I have the best job training programs there are with internships and all things, and I would look very closely at the German model and anybody else that has a markedly lower unemployment rate overall and among young people. Then I would be looking at anybody that's done an especially good job of getting small and medium-sized firms to grow, to get into exporting. And the third thing I think that has been underappreciated here is the difference in your unemployment system and ours. I begged the Congress when our economy nearly ran off the rails in 2008, and they were trying to think about what to do, to look at beg may be too strong, but I strongly suggested that they look at the German unemployment system, because Germany doesn't wait until a small business lays somebody off. If they're in danger of doing that, they can collect part of the unemployment fund to keep the person employed. It is much less expensive. So the first thing I think should be done is that every person in every critical ministry in the Eurozone should be 100% familiar with everything everybody else is doing if their results are better than yours. And then you have to ask yourself, would this be applicable to us or not? And if it wouldn't work now, why not? And how can we fix this? Because I really do think you can't get away from the fact that you have an enormous amount of human capital, an enormous amount of intellectual infrastructure, an enormous amount of physical infrastructure. I have a friend that I was just reminded who lives in Madrid and is working hundreds of people making new software. So if there's one firm doing that, how could there be 100? What difference would it make? Almost by definition, all the employees are young. People my age have to wait for our children or grandchildren to explain why we should do certain things with our technology. So I really believe, I don't know this, but my sense, just talking, going from country to country, is that we haven't maximized the extent to which we could all be learning from each other. I used to be, when I was a governor, and I was for a dozen years, I used to say I was always prouder to be the second state doing something than to be the first state doing it. Because when you're in politics, you're afraid you don't really get credit if you just copy somebody else. I think it is the smartest thing you can do. Saves a lot of time. Right? Saves a lot of, so that's my first little bit of advice for whatever it's worth.
Thank you so much. Before I go to my next question, I want to make sure all of our students around the world don't miss the most important lesson that any teacher could ever provide, which is when Minister von der Leyen said that you shouldn't spend more than you make. So this is something that governments are learning now, but many, many households try to remember to teach this to their students, and we should be doing the same as well. You mentioned small and medium business, and my next question really is on that topic. We are spending a lot of time at Laureate, as you know, thinking about where employment is going. And it seems very clear that employment is moving much more towards small business and self-employment. And this morning I had a chance to talk a little bit about what this really means. I think that we often get confused by the term entrepreneurship. We think of Sergey Brin starting Google, but a young student who graduates out of dentistry and opens their own dental clinic or their own dental practice is an entrepreneur. They're taking on a loan, they're taking on a lease, they're taking on some risk. And I think we want to make sure that we encourage students to think about self-employment and small business without the obligation to think that it's entrepreneurship and that they're going to have some rocket ship idea. And I'm curious, you've talked a lot about entrepreneurship. Well, what do you think about this?
I agree with that, but I think the thing that's driving this trend, at least, and will continue to drive it for the next 10 years, is that a lot of the firms all over the world that shed huge numbers of people after the crash and are now doing pretty well have discovered a couple of things. They've discovered, number one, that they were forced to become more productive, and that just simply meant we weren't having as much money coming in, so we needed fewer people to do more work in a smarter way. They became more productive in that way. And secondly, in the intervening years since the crash, there have been further technological advances and new technological applications that apply to every sector of the economy. So that at least, I can only say this, in the United States, a lot of these companies are never going to hire those people back. Now, if their business doubles or triples or quadruples, because they would just prefer to contract it out, which creates an enormous set of new opportunities for people, but only if they can go into business for themselves or be part of one of these smaller enterprises. So I do think there is a long-term structural change here, and probably every country has some data on the extent to which it exists in that country, and all the training programs, and by the way, the financing programs available to small business should be targeted accordingly.
To continue with that topic, one of the challenges as educators, if someone is going to leave university and work for an employer, all they really need to bring are their technical skills and a great attitude. And we heard a lot about that this morning, the preference of employers for people with great attitudes. If someone is going to go into any form of self-employment, they need things like financial literacy and other training that typically universities don't provide them. And that's something that we've been focused on trying to understand ourselves. What do you think about that?
I think you should provide it. I think that any university that offers any sort of a degree in economics or business or courses related to helping people either find employment or start businesses when they leave should have a constantly updated list of things people need to know, skills people need to have, and they ought to make sure they have them. And 6 months from now, they'll be ever so slightly different than they are today. And I just think that we have to do that. We owe that to our young people, and we owe that to the hunger people have to be able to support themselves and make a contribution, start a family, live a life. This has been psychologically enormously challenging for millions and millions and millions of people all over the world. Continues to be in our country. We have a different problem. You have this youth unemployment problem here as I think by far your biggest problem. We are having a terrible time finding jobs for middle-aged people without university degrees. They tend to be unemployed for a year, then once people have been unemployed for a year, even if they keep looking for work, the employers almost shudder at the sight of them. They're afraid there's something wrong with them. And normally there's nothing wrong with them except they couldn't find a job. And all of us, we're going to have to deal with this. One of our best community colleges in the United States is in Cleveland, Ohio, which first of all dealt with the loss of a lot of its manufacturing base. Then they came roaring back with a lot of service industries, and especially the Cleveland Clinic, which is a massive American healthcare complex. So the Cleveland Clinic and the community college said, you know, we don't know about the rest of America. We just know here where we're going to be 5 years from now with healthcare. And this was at a time before our healthcare bill passed. So they had a big, public, transparent process to identify the jobs that would grow in number as the baby boomers retired, whether or not President Obama's healthcare bill passed. And they identified these jobs and they said, here's how many we have now, here's how many we'll have in 3 years, here's how many we'll have in 5 years, and in 7 years. And they got the Cleveland Clinic to promise to hire people if they came out of the training program with training in those areas. And they said, here are the numbers of the following 5 job sets, and here's the starting pay. And they told people before they went in what they would get. And that people who were middle-aged and had not worked in more than 6 months would be given priority. And it began to work. So I think, you know, we're going to have to do a lot of microeconomics here. We're going to have to recognize that local economies may not be Germany and Austria. It may be, you know, one town and another town just 40 miles away. And most politicians who have headed nations have only talked about macroeconomics. I think now we need not just the labor minister, not just the education minister, we need more and more people who run for public office expert in microeconomics. What are the specific business needs and possibilities and employment needs and possibilities area by area? And then, who's doing better than you are and how can you copy from them quickly?
We were talking about small business. I want to turn for a moment to bigger companies. We were very fortunate earlier today to have leaders from some of Europe's largest companies comment on what they see as the needs of the workplace. We have an executive from Vorwerk, which is a company in Germany that indirectly employs 600,000 people. I was amazed to hear. We have the president of Manpower, which is, how many people, Jonas? How many employees? 4 million employees during the year. We have representatives of some leading Spanish companies. The CEO of Prisa was here a little bit earlier, I know. The CEO of Steelcase Spain, a gentleman from Turkey who's responsible for the Fiat and Chrysler business there. Incredible employers talking to us about what the needs of this area would be. I'm curious, when you think about big companies, is there anything that you think they can or should be doing differently? They're reacting as economic response as should be expected of them, but maybe there's something more we should be asking of them.
Well, I think that, first of all, you just described, just in this sentence, 3 radically different large enterprises. If you employ 4 million people a year, you represent what I think is going to happen. The labor markets are becoming more balkanized, to be more specialized, to be more flexible, right? So that means we can already learn a lot from their experience about what kind of training can be done. If somebody employs a stable 600,000 people a year, I would say they're really good at what they do, and what we need to do is to figure out, can we find more business for them? And is there some partnership between the governments and the private sector that would find new opportunities? For example, I just signed an agreement in South America this week, in Peru, with our foundation, or actually my foundation signed it, I didn't, but I was there. We signed it with Procter & Gamble and Nestle, 2 giant companies, right? One of them a big European company, one a big American company. But it will affect employment everywhere. They like this program we're running down there, selling products to the poorest people in Peru in the most physically remote places. And we found a delivery system more efficient than anything they could find on their own. And so they promised to increase dramatically the volume they were selling of these products by letting us sell it at a lower price, because they're going to cut their price to us. That will ripple back and have an impact on American and European employment there. There are no general rules just because a business is big. It depends on what their situation is, who they're selling to, what they're selling, what their prospects for growth are. I think you have to, we don't need a lot of shotguns here. We need a rifle. One rifle after another. You have to pinpoint these challenges and seize them, I think.
Thank you. The next question we're going to get is from a student of ours at ISLA, which is our institution in Lisbon, Portugal. And she writes that sometimes emigration to emerging economies, like the BRIC countries, seems to be our only way to find a job. Is this the future, or is there another way?
It's a big part of the future. I think if you look at Brazil and a country that's not on the BRIC list, Mexico, which produced, by the way, thanks to 140 new tuition-free universities established by the previous president, Calderon, Mexico produced 113,000 engineers last year. For the last 2 years, Mexico's economy grew faster than Brazil's. And for the last 2 years, for the first time, maybe in my lifetime, there was no net in-migration from Mexico to the United States. In other words, as many as Mexicans as came across the Rio Grande River went home because they could find a good job at home now, which I think is wonderful. So if you believe that intelligence is evenly distributed and that over time now preparation, investment, and opportunity are becoming more evenly distributed, it stands to reason that people who start from a lower base will have a more rapid growth rate in the beginning of their endeavors. And if they too have certain population constraints, you may be able to go to these places and find a better job than you can right now because Europe is not yet out of its difficulties. But ideally, for a young person like the person who sent our question, you'd be able to choose to live at home. And that's why I think it is urgent that those of us who are older than you, who don't have to worry about where our next paycheck is coming from, figure out as quickly as possible how to restore growth to the Eurozone so you can stay home and do that too. But I don't think there will be rules, both either you can stay home and do great or you have to leave to do great. I don't think it's going to be like that. I think for the rest of this questioner's lifetime, there will be periods when there will be global slowdowns, periods when there'll be regional slowdowns, periods when for complex local reasons, some countries will do better than others. God gave them more natural resources, or the people gave this country a worse government, or whatever. The thing is, it's just a highly flexible situation, which is why your education is more important, because you're going to have to redefine security away from just being able to live in one place and have one job and know it'll always be there. Unfortunately, and fortunately, your life will have more change. It'll be much more interesting, but you will feel less secure unless you know you have maximized your options to deal with it.
I would just add one thing to that, Mr. President, which is that while it sounds bad when someone is forced to go abroad to find a job, the fact is that a university student, like the one who sent us that question, who works in multiple countries, ends up very valuable. And I think it could be thought of as something that you're forced to do, or it could be thought of as something that gives you a permanent edge in today's world to understand how to influence people in other cultures to do what needs to be done.
And it'll probably make you more employable if you want to go home to Portugal when the economy picks up.
Absolutely. The next question comes from one of our students in Paris. And the question is, when do you think recruiters will start to take notice of more than the diploma, but what a student actually knows?
Oh, I think that's going to happen a lot, particularly if recruiters can be picky, which is why I think one of the things we should be trying to do is setting up, during the education and training process, more apprenticeships and other direct contacts with the employers. I think that the countries which generally are thick with really close collaboration between the education sector and the work sector are far more likely to have maximum employment, maximum efficiency in the labor markets, and good results. I think I can certainly tell you that from my experience and observation just in the United States, that's true.
I think a lot of employers already feel this way. We were having a conversation this morning that the famous grade point average, GPA, is such a poor reflection of what a student can do. It may be a good reflection that they studied, what courses they took, and that they passed their tests, and that's very important. But that is no longer sufficient for an employer to feel that that student is differentiated. So we were talking about creating an LPA, a Laureate analysis that would be like a portfolio assessment that would indicate to an employer what you could do, whether you worked well in teams. You mentioned apprenticeships. We actually have mandatory internships. And then we manage that like an academic part of the curriculum, meaning we assess whether the internship was successful or not and provide some rules of engagement on the internship. So I think it would be very exciting. Maybe next year we'll be able to show you an LPA instead of a GPA. I think that could be a very constructive development. Now we have time for only one more question, and I'd like to turn it really towards the topic of hope, because this is a very difficult time for Europe and for Spain and for young people in Spain. We're in the midst of the worst youth unemployment crisis since the Second World War. You may have seen when you came in the cover story from a week ago from The Economist talking about a mountain of unemployed youth and the consequences of that. So my question to you would be, how do you inspire young people in this environment not to lose hope?
Well, first of all, I think we ought to start by really leveling with them. I feel almost that we owe the younger generation a collective apology because they had nothing to do with this economic crisis, and now they turned out to be the most adversely affected group as a result of it. But they need to understand this is, particularly in Europe, this is part of a new world struggling to be born. And in Europe, you're facing the global trend, which is there are lots of young people unemployed all over the world. One of the reasons that Tahrir Square happened and that Mr. Mubarak fell is that the Egyptian universities continued every year to produce 400,000 graduates, and the Egyptian economy didn't produce anywhere close to 400,000 jobs for new graduates. There's a youth unemployment problem in Nigeria, where my foundation does a lot of work, and many other places. So all over the world, there is this problem of creating enough jobs for young people, aggravated by the things that young people are best at, which is all kinds of technology which make labor ever more productive and efficient, which means that fewer people can do more work, and therefore to create more new jobs, you have to have constantly developing new enterprises, new areas of activity. In rough terms, you can say, for example, if you're an American, okay, we've gotten another 10 years out of the information technology revolution, and maybe we'll get a little more, but we need to really double down on what's happening in biotech now. We need to, in other words, depending on where you live, you can chart out what you think your reasonable prospects are and do your best to try to create more jobs, but it's a general problem. Then here, the problem is aggravated, as it was in America, by errors that were made, too lax lending standards, and the fact that all these things that happen in Europe and in America, we started it, which I want to apologize for it, happened to a Europe that is fairly young, that was operating, in my opinion, superbly, just as the creators of the European experiment wanted. But this happened about 10 years before this system had actually calibrated itself well enough to think about what would happen to a union with a common currency, without a common fiscal policy, without a common stimulus policy, without a common economic policy. What would happen if you had a severe downturn in most, but not all of these countries? And we just need to be honest with young people. But I will tell you this, wherever you are, particularly all of you listening in at these Laureate schools, if you know something worth knowing, if you're willing to keep learning, if you're willing to work hard, and if you're willing to be flexible enough to go where the work is until you can come home to where the work should be, you're going to do fine. This still should be the most interesting, exciting time in human history. I mean, look at all the stuff that we've learned. We've identified 20 planets outside our solar system that might support life. We might not even be here alone. There may be people listening to us today that think we're whining over something that doesn't amount to much. In a whole parallel universe. I've often felt that I lived in a parallel universe being in politics, but I mean, seriously, look what we have learned just from the sequencing of the human genome. Look what we are learning every day from new discoveries of all kinds. In particle physics last year, the long-sought God particle, the Higgs boson, was identified that causes matter to adhere, was identified at the CERN lab in Switzerland, which was an international consortium of scientists there. Look, the world looks, for all the violence and everything, we're living in the most diverse societies ever known in humanity. And young people have less racial and religious and other prejudices than ever before. We are tied together by technology in ways that would have been unimaginable just a few years ago. You know, my first year as president 20 years ago when I became president, the average cell phone weighed 5 pounds. And there were only 50 sites on the entire internet. Far more than that have been added since we started talking today. So I think you should be optimistic, but you can't be passive. You can't expect someone to just hand you a living, hand you an opportunity, and you have to face the fact that your parents and grandparents did not foresee every problem that has arisen, and that we now have a problem for which we were not properly organized. We have to all admit that. Believe it or not, your generation will make mistakes too. We just don't know what they are yet. And the less time we spend crying about this and the more time we spend thinking about it, the more likely we are to get a good result and get something done. The only other thing I would say is this, and I see this in America every day. These political arguments are good. We ought to have lots of them because no one's got the whole truth, and complex problems do not lend themselves to solutions by one mind. But in the end, we have to find ways to make agreements. The world today, you look at it all over the world, it belongs to people who practice constructive, creative cooperation. And where you have these constant conflicts that paralyze the possibility of compromise, nothing gets done. In the end, something has to get done. So my advice to young people is be as prepared as you can, enjoy the good things that are happening in life, pressure the people in politics and business to keep making changes to create more opportunity for you. But there's no reason to be despairing. I mean, the world has changed dramatically over the last 20 years. Some of it is bad. There's too much inequality, too much instability. We haven't responded properly to climate change. There are lots of identity crises still fueling conflict around the world. But on balance, go back and look at how people were living then and what they were fighting over then. The slaughter in the Balkans then. The genocide in Rwanda then. It's so tempting to rewrite history looking backwards. You should be optimistic about the future, and you should be frank about where we have let you down and go fix it. Nothing is wrong that is insoluble. Go fix it and have a good time doing it.
Well, Mr. President, on behalf of the university and Laureate, all of our guests and all of our students, I want to thank you so much for giving us that inspiration and ideas, and also for encouraging us to convene this event. I think for all of us, it's been a great day, and I hope the beginning of some contribution to such a difficult problem. I want to make sure I also thank the ministers who attended the last panel, which I thought was just terrific, also our employer and educator panels. I want to thank the Prince, who will be closing the event in just a few minutes, so much for providing his convening authority to this event and for your personal attendance. Thank you so much. And
I have to say one thing. This is shameless on my part. But the first time I met Prince Felipe, he was a dashing young man, just out of his military training, about to start graduate studies at my university, Georgetown in Washington. And so his mother and father asked me to look after him, which I never did, for which he was immensely grateful. And I'm very proud of him, but he is a very good example of what a good education will do for a good mind, well-directed. And that's a plug for our university, but also a tribute to him, and I'm grateful that he's here today. Thank you very much.
So I don't know what to say rather than thank you so much, President Clinton and Doug. That was a truly inspirational discussion, and you have given all of us a lot to think about. So before we close out the day, I want to thank all of you again for joining us here at Universidad Europea. I know that you are all very busy people, and we appreciate your attendance and participation to today's event. So let's all build on the great energy and wonderful ideas that we have heard to keep the conversation going and work together to find solutions. With that, I would like to introduce His Royal Highness, Prince of Asturias. Alteza.
Thank you so much, President Clinton and Honorary Chancellor of Laureate International Universities, Secretaria de Estado de Educación, Formación Profesional y Universidades, Doug Becker, Founder, Chairman and CEO of Laureate Education, Miguel Carmelo, CEO, Europe and Mediterranean Region of Laureate Education, and President of this university. Allow me to greet the ministers that are with us, Minister of Education from Ireland, of Labour from Germany, and Education and Culture from Cyprus, and former Minister of Culture from Italy, and also the Secretary General, El Secretario General Iberoamericano, Enrique Iglesias. Authorities, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests from this university and from many of the centers of the Laureate Education universities around the world and especially around Europe, distinguished members of the business and academic communities, good afternoon. I'm not going to tire you any longer with many remarks about the very important topics you have talked about, and moreover, I wouldn't be so arrogant as to add anything new, because I understand you have been having a very intense day at it. But allow me to give you just a few remarks to close the day. And allow me to begin by thanking the European University of Madrid for inviting me to this timely event dedicated to such pressing issues, quite surely one of the most important problems, or the most important problem we face in Europe today, particularly in countries such as Spain. Laureate International Universities has hit the spot in calling up today's summit on youth and jobs in Europe on the demand for more job opportunities, the need for better education and training, the search for new areas of rapid and solid growth, providing new employment and higher employment rates, and searching for the best practices, as President Clinton has mentioned, and public policies around the world to enhance all of these areas. In this summit, we have benefited from the participation of many experts, quite a remarkable list of panelists, including the intervention and experience of President Bill Clinton. Allow me to say, first of all, thank you for your personal remarks, and allow me to say as well that for me, having studied in Georgetown University and throughout the years 93 through 95, I will always consider my US President President Clinton, because I enjoyed my time in his country. I enjoyed his personal hospitality and that of the First Lady, then Hillary, and therefore I will always be grateful to that. Thank you. And thank you all for your contributions. It has been a real privilege to have you here in Madrid with us. And also, and welcome, even though it's now the closing remarks, I want to extend a few words of welcome to all of you who have traveled to join us in this event here in Madrid. Congratulations to all of the organizers, European University of Madrid and Laureate System. Rectora, Presidente, congratulations to you all on a wonderful job. In order to tackle a problem that directly or indirectly affects societies throughout Europe and in many other parts of the world, we truly need everyone to become involved. It is a collective challenge that needs to be addressed from a wide perspective and overview, as it has been done here in this forum, before focusing on each case or particular country to address specific issues and policies. And I think we can all agree that the smart thing to do is to hear and to listen what the experts have to say, and to study and analyze the vision and the points of view of companies, scholars, and governments, of employers, educators, and policymakers. These three actors are, as you know, crucial in finding solutions to a complex, multidimensional problem. Governments and public institutions have the responsibility of designing and implementing policies in order to foster the creation of stable employment. Schools and universities must provide young people with the necessary skills, occupational skills. And businesses need to create opportunities for professional growth in a constantly changing environment. Moreover, having said all this, we must convey a message charged with optimism, as you have done so today, President Clinton, to young people who are suffering the consequences of a crisis that is preventing their access to the labor market, that is blocking their legitimate demand to a decent job and a natural aspiration to a successful professional career and to prosper. We must encourage young people to face up these problems with a positive and proactive perspective. This attitude is essential to overcome any difficulty. I am aware that it is not easy to say this to young people when they are resolutely and fiercely fighting a reality that is often very bleak. But they need to know, you need to know, that we are all with you, that your individual challenges in this regard are also collective challenges and pertain to the entire society. This goes beyond the frequent cliché of young people constitute our future. Of course they do, and it holds for any moment of history. But today's situation makes it an urgent imperative to find solutions. In many instances, it is a question of survival and a hard test on our models of government, of the modern and global reality we face. And we cannot afford to lose hope. Therefore, we need to work hard to keep it in place, to make sure there is hope. And in that note, I will conclude by saying that I am quite sure that these debates have shed light on this complex issue, which is so important to the welfare and the future of our societies. Once again, thank you very much for your efforts, for your participation, and for your valuable contributions. And also a word of greetings to all those who are following and listening across the network. Thank you so much.